This is a message to the hundreds of thousands of financial victims across Australia. Get behind the frail, elderly, vulnerable, dying victims of the Sterling First collapse, because if the government won't compensate them, it won't compensate anybody. I'm Robert Barwick from the Citizens Party. Our party got involved in fighting for the victims of Sterling First last year when we saw the fight they were waging to get justice for the losses they'd made getting sucked into a scheme in which they only thought they'd paid rent in advance for the rest of their life. Instead, they were lured into a scheme where they are now being told they're investors. The problem is ASIC knew all along what sort of scheme it was. And ASIC did nothing, the regulator, ASIC did nothing to proactively police the scheme, knowing that it was targeting vulnerable elderly people. ASIC ignored repeated complaints even from inside ASIC, and it did nothing until more than 100 couples had been caught up in the scheme and lost $18 million. It led to a big inquiry last year. The chairman of ASIC complained about that inquiry. And now the question is, what gets done for these victims? These are elderly people. 20 of them have already died. They've lost everything in the last years of their life. They've lost everything. They must be compensated. Yesterday, the Labor Party's Shadow Financial Services Minister, Stephen Jones, attended a meeting of those victims in Western Australia. And he said to them, vote for us, we will expand this thing called the compensation scheme of last resort and get you to the front of the queue. This pledge from Stephen Jones is virtually meaningless because he can say, yes, we've put you to the front of the queue, and some other agency decides whether they get compensation or not. And when he was asked by a member of the audience, will you commit to paying $18 million to compensate us as victims? He said no. And then he said, no politician or political party can commit to that. That is false. This is something the government, any government, can do through an act of grace payment by the Finance Department. They would do it on the basis that they accept this is ASIC's fault and therefore the government's responsibility. And that's the problem, because the government and the Labor Party do not want to own up to this being ASIC's fault, even though the final report of the inquiry that was handed down in February acknowledged ASIC's failings in that report. That's one thing for the report to say. The government does not want to set the precedent of owning up to ASIC's failings and taking responsibility as the responsible entity for ASIC in paying out. That's what they're trying to avoid. And they will let these people be evicted onto the streets rather than own up to that responsibility. And that's the Labor Party's position at the moment. And so if you're a financial victim around Australia who's been fighting for years for some kind of recognition of what was done to you and the injustice you endured, and you need justice and you need compensation, and you're hanging out for some kind of commitment to do that, and you're being told by the political parties, yes, we're going to have this compensation scheme of last resort, yes, stick with us, there will be a system to take care of this. Pay attention to what's going on with Sterling First, because a government and an opposition that will not commit to compensating those victims will never be able to be relied upon to compensate you as a victim. And there's hundreds of thousands of financial victims around Australia, 200,000 financial victims of managed investment schemes since 2008 alone, who've lost $40 billion. There's thousands more financial victims who've lost money in mortgages and all sorts of other things, bad bank behaviour, a lot of which was revealed at the Royal Commission. You're hanging out for justice. This is the way to get justice. These victims, if you look at their case, they are the people behind which the country can rally to force either the government to change its position or the Labor Party to strengthen its position to one of actually committing to compensation. And in doing so, commit to taking responsibility for ASIC's failings and cleaning up the system. That's the reason the Citizens Party is involved. We are taking on the government and the Labor Party on this. We want to put excruciating pressure on the Labor Party in this pre-election period to commit to a proper policy. We're calling on Stephen Jones to face up to the reality here, look these victims in the eye, look at the fact they're dying and about to be evicted, and realise that what he said this week in Western Australia to those victims is nowhere near adequate, and actually commit to change the party's position before the election. Get in touch with the Citizens Party to find out what you can do. We need every victims group around Australia to fight on this, right? We will put maximum pressure on these political parties using the Sterling First victims as the example for all victims across Australia. Because if we can get a breakthrough on that, we set the precedent that they don't want to set. And then that precedent applies to you and what you've been through, right? This is very serious. We have to fight and we have to win. Join us.
Spoken and authorised by Robert Bowick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.